Salutations. In this video, I'm going to explain how Donald Trump meets the definition of demagogue and elucidate why he's so highly effectual at demagoguery. Well, demagogue is synonymous with populist. Demagogue is someone who appeals to the lowest common denominator. Well, I'll go through the checklist later. And the word demagogue is sometimes misused to brand insurgent politicians and delegitimize them when established politicians or the incumbents wish to stop considerable change. But in Trump's case, the use of demagogue is accurate. Now, many countries have had demagogues, and they've been around for millennia, since ancient Greece. There's a handbook of tactics, and Trump appears to borrow these techniques, and indeed he's masterful at it. It's frighteningly familiar when you see what he's doing, presenting his opponents as monodimensional monsters, and not as opponents, as enemies. He appeals to a perverted form of patriotism, and he brooks no restraint. He's open in his disrespect for law and institutions. He presents reasonableness as weakness, and he advocates for barbarous policies. Anyway, there's not going to be hyperbole from me. This is not leading to democide. It would be foolish to say that Trump is going to become like Hitler. And no need to overstate things. So Trump is gifted when it comes to demagoguery. Has he studied it? I doubt it. He's not known as the bookish type or someone who rehearses things. He has an oratorical gift for arousing unbridled rage. So he capitalizes on the bigotry and the lack of knowledge of many of his hearers. He targets those of inferior academic ability, which is why he said about 3 years ago, "I love the less well-educated." Well, I can think why. He indulges in folksy language, and he contrasts sharply with President Obama, who was too professorial, too pensive, who came across to some as conceited, and Trump is certainly not an ivory tower intellectual. You couldn't accuse him of being overly cerebral or using Floridan polysyllabic language. Trump comes from a book-burning tradition of anti-intellectualism. He exploits the lack of knowledge of other countries in his audience, and indeed, I think he genuinely lacks such knowledge himself. It's a sad degeneration because 10 years ago, when Sarah Palin was trying to become vice president, stupidity was disadvantageous for her. Trump has managed to turn it into an advantage. And this is not a boon, the way things have gone. So there's a fear of the unknown, and Trump exploits this to the max. He scapegoats out groups, and he appeals to this in-group, whites, white males, rural whites. There's a kind of an in-group for him, white working class to some extent. So he tells the in-group that they are victims of the out-group, of the ethnic minorities and so on. And he appeals to a nostalgia for an era which didn't really exist when the working class was doing well. You know, even back in, say, the glory days of the early 70s before stagflation, all right, wages were higher in real terms, but there was still considerable poverty in the United States. So talking about the good old days and making the most of resentment and promulgating these conspiracy theories. Then he exploits the fear and detestation of sex crimes in particular. Why that? When he first became known for saying, "Oh, the Mexicans are not sending their best people," they're not sent by anyone. They're not sent by the government. They're choosing to go as individuals. He said they're bringing drugs, they're rapists. Why that particular crime? Not murder, fascinatingly, which is the ultimate crime, because we know that sex evokes love, and therefore sex crime evokes hatred. It's the most emotive one, so he's going to hit that one as hard as he could. He knows the psychological buttons to press, and so by demonizing Mexicans as rapists, he knows he will infuriate his audience and get them on side. He likes to peddle many a mythos about, I think it was General Pershing in the Philippines, supposing dipping bullets in pig's blood to shoot Muslims because that would petrify them. This was despite the tale being comprehensively debunked. He couldn't help but try to disseminate this falsehood. So he tells America that it's under threat, that it's teetering on the brink between calamity and salvation, and he is the savior. And for those who grew up on savior myths, this is, of course, very appealing. So that's why a lot of his supporters are highly religious, they're unreasoning, and he knows how to excite feeling among the public. His style is always emotional and not rational. Now, there's a lot of that in any good public speaker, but he is really overboard in being more or less totally emotive and not in the least rational. He seeks to silence dispassionate, deliberative discussion because important issues ought to be debated calmly and without emotion in order to reach a sensible and balanced conclusion. But no, Trump goes in for verbal pyrotechnics. It's performance art for him, and that's why he's got a highly theatrical style. Say what you like about him, but he's not dull on stage. He has stage presence. So he consciously appeals to the common people. They find it very alluring when he says he's a man of the people, which is obviously completely bogus. But what chutzpah for him to do so. Appear wearing that baseball cap, the uniform of the proletariat. The ball cap was a prop with his slogan, "Make America Great Again" on it. He's all things to all people. And obviously behind closed doors, he was saying to his fellow billionaire chums, "I'm going to make you a whole lot richer." Of course, in public, pretending that his tax cuts were aimed at the proletariat. Saying he's a Christian when he's not known to go to church very much. He never used to bang on about being a Christian before. Look at his hundreds of media interviews down the years. Only about 3 years ago, he started wearing Jesus on his sleeve and talking about 2 Corinthians, when anybody who knows anything about the Bible will tell you it's 2 Corinthians. An error that basic exposes the man for the fraud he is. He used to be a Democrat, but you won't see him saying that now. Now he's a Republican. So his secret is simplicity. His ideas have got to be few, brief, simple, endlessly repeated. So he sticks to just a few key themes about jobs, tax cuts, terrorism and illegal immigration, and they're all interconnected for him. So he advocates instant and drastic policies. There's no sense of calibrating a policy that we mustn't go too far. Not doing any impact assessment. He plays fast and loose with the figures, simply plucks numbers out of the air, invent anything he wants to. He's not in the least bit prudent. There is no analysis of possible repercussions. If we do this, what will happen? Any negative consequences? So that's why he doesn't stop to think and doesn't encourage his supporters to do likewise. You look at some of the policies advocated for. The Muslim ban, which he didn't even attempt to implement. Only a ban on 7 Muslim majority countries, and obviously be banned even if you weren't a Muslim. Pakistani Christian, you wouldn't be allowed in. If you were a Jewish Iranian, you wouldn't be allowed in. If you were an Iraqi Yazidi, you wouldn't be allowed in, and so on. Calling for frank torture, which he's actually not tried to implement. Deliberate targeting of civilians, that's what he advocated. He's not tried to do that. Bomb the shit out of ISIS. So you see the use of such Anglo-Saxonisms would be highly inappropriate, such vulgarity, and yet these supposedly clean living people lapped it up. If you know so much about the Bible, you'd know in Colossians, St. Paul says not to use foul language. There he was resorting to profanity. He was asked, what will you do if the military disobey your illegal orders? Trust me, they will. Trust me, that's it. And there is trust in the eyes of so many of his acolytes. So it's all about charismatic leadership. Trust me. He dehumanizes other ethnicities, saying that these unarmed people moving across Mexico were an invasion, picked up by many of his cheerleaders. People moving in peacefully are an invasion, sending the military when they're not even allowed to do anything as an electoral gimmick, not sending the military to help their comrades in Afghanistan. 15,000 troops on the Mexican border, more than in Afghanistan, where there's actual combat going on, so neglecting real combat missions for this charade. He appealed to the left-behind blue-collars, as demagogues often do. They were middle-aged to elderly mostly, not the youth so much. It was regarded by flyover territory. by mainstream politicians. So Trump was astute in this regard. I don't know if he'd studied the psephology. He issued promises he knew he couldn't possibly fulfill. Now, many politicians trim. Non-selectivity in what they say is not found amongst politicians. There will be willful omission, perhaps lies of omission in some cases. They might overstate, they might dabble in half-truths. But with Trump, it was the constant and wholesale publication of untruths that made him egregious. His all-out assault on the very notion of the truth was staggering. As his enabler, Giuliani, said, "Truth is not truth." Well, that ought to be the motto of the Trump administration. Truth is not truth. It's a watershed in American political life. So Trump overlooked embarrassing truths, such as he funded the Clintons, and then they were so evil, according to him. He had made his branded goods manufactured abroad, and yet he believes in not sending jobs overseas. So he was such a flagrant hypocrite, and he didn't even deny that he'd had his products manufactured in other lands. He married foreigners twice, thereby enabling immigration, which he thought was so calamitous. His mother was an immigrant. Was she evil? So there was a rabble at his rallies. It was remorseless in lambasting his opponents. He's very energetic, and that's why he galvanized the heretofore apathetic. People hadn't bothered to vote for several elections. So he attracted people who were misinformed. He heightened their hysteria, their fear and hatred towards immigrants, legal and illegal. He capitalizes on crises such as mass shootings. Only I can sort it out because only I'll be brutal enough. He demands extraordinary power, and such as saying the steel tariff is a national security issue. It's nothing to do with the war. He wants to rule by fiat. That's very fickle, and because he wants untrammeled powers, he reacts with rage to any limitation on his presidential prerogatives. He accused his opponents of treason, despite his open contempt of rule of law and despite his questionable relationship with other governments. Policies don't matter to him. That's why the separating parents from children of illegal immigrants was dropped like a stone at one point. These things can be very soon abandoned. It can all change very fast. He's highly erratic. It changes in an instant because he's so whimsical. And this caprice doesn't seem to put off his supporters who have blind faith in him. And these are people of faith in the other sense too. So he's got no staying power. There's no constancy with him. He's always generating more heat than light. He depicts other politicians as being limp-wristed, weak-willed, hidebound by custom and tradition, part of the failed establishment, as he would say. So he has the chutzpah as a New York WASP son of a multimillionaire to say he's anti-establishment. He is the establishment. To say he'll drain the swamp of Wall Street. He's not anti-Wall Street. They lent him so much. They stopped lending in about 2000 when he was obviously such a disaster, had lost so many billions. The king of debt who couldn't pay them back. He's packed his cabinet with Wall Street insiders, and he told the billionaires that he would enrich them further. For once, he spoke true. So he's just absolutely shameless and will tell the most blatant lies and get away with it. Who would be so impudent to tell such an arrant and obvious untruth? So he peddles these outright false narratives, such as the military being needed against the caravan, which I already touched on. So this jaw-dropping dishonesty does not discourage so many of his disciples. He's in a league of his own for the sheer scale and flagrancy of his lying. He's as bold as brass when he lied about his fortune, but he's not willing to prove how much he had or how much he inherited his father, despite these being provable, documented lies about his friendships, who he's met. Oh, I know him very well. No, I never even met him. I don't know him. About the election results, on and on and on. So he's long ago figured out that once you have true believers, that nothing will ever convince them otherwise of something they've chosen to believe. They're committed, and it would be too much of an existential crisis to face up to the fact that they've been conned, and he is a confidence trickster. So it's charismatic rule by him. Is always a presentiment that he works on, this gut instinct that if he was impeached, it would crash the economy. So it's me or disaster. If it's the datum he doesn't like, he claims it's bogus. He doesn't rely on hard evidence. You'd think empirical data would be crucial for sensible policy making. No, it's all done on a hunch. So he appeals to the lowest common denominator, naked racial prejudice. That's why the federal government found that he had pursued racist policies in housing way back in the 70s. It's a toxic mix of primitive capitalism, religious mania, chauvinism, and militarism. So he poses as a man of the people with a limited vocabulary. I think in that sense he is genuine in having a narrow lexis. Eating McDonald's, I wonder if that's studied. His total lack of cultural refinement is highly attractive to some people, claiming to be an anti-elitist and saying the elite are out of touch, which is a bit true. And he eviscerates people for being overeducated. Being censured by the educated helps him. Other presidents were uniters. You see how divisive he is, but he demands people then unite behind him. They should be docile and blindly obedient. It's always a them and us narrative with him. That's why he vilifies the other side. But we have to be united. It's obviously completely illogical and self-contradictory. It's all about demonization with him, scapegoating the outgroup, the minorities, often poorer, they're pariahs to some extent. And it's as though the weak and the omnipotent have swapped sides, as though these minorities have power over the whites and not the other way around. So he can manipulate the mob by feeding their prejudice. He never confronts them head on. Instead, he praises them to the moon, how the salt of the earth. Tell them what they want to hear. They want to be scared. That's why fear is a power structure. That's why Halloween and horror movies are so popular. And people are frightened, they'll be willing to jettison civil liberties. They fear death, that leads to faith, in religion and in politics. Fascinatingly, one of the few outgroups he's not excoriated are gays. I don't know why. So calling people traitors and enemies of the people, like a totalitarian tyrant. His disdain for laws and norms appeals to many people. You see his outrageous behaviour, swearing, talking about the size of his penis, insulting women about menstruation. It's attention-seeking behaviour. Now there's attention-seeking in many people, including in yours truly. I like to think I've got something worthwhile to say, but for him, it's not really about the content. It's just anything to make a splash. So in common with many politicians, he's a bit of an exhibitionist, but he takes it to a new level with his vulgarity, even with the garishness of his interior design, his ostentatiousness, his displays of wealth, and his non-stop braggadocio. So he detests logical reasoning because serious topics would require sober consideration, and that's not his style. That would be too bland for him. It's all about visceral feeling, gut hatreds. That's what he motivates in people, fury, aggression, and that's why his rallies are so full of tumult and shrieking at his rallies, and that's why there's turmoil at the White House. It dramatizes the situation. It's like a crowd at a football match where they're pent up with passion, rage, and identity. That's why he displays excessive machismo and goes in for this immature, posturing, swaggering. He appeals to this national small man syndrome, which is astonishing in the mightiest country on earth. He's against the measured use of language. Someone like Obama would weigh his words. There's no tranquil reflection in Trump, which a leader ought to display. So he derives support from those who wish to abolish civil liberties. That's why he said he was going to keep Gitmo open, he was going to use torture, wanted summary execution, and he detests the free media despite it being his lifeblood. Imagine if he didn't have access to the media, calling the press corps enemies of the people. And he hates freedom of religion, wants Muslims to be persecuted. He slanders his foes as liars, but of course he's the greatest liar himself. And he decries the press for telling the truth, for reporting him accurately. He projects his own vices onto his opponents. He demands blind loyalty, but is totally disloyal to his followers. He wanted Sessions to do his bidding, and he hates restrictions on his power. So the faithful swallow his lives wholesale. Vanity is Trump's watchword. So it's all about action, not about the legislative process so much. He's not honouring his promise. He vowed that Medicare and Medicaid was safe in his hands. He did the precise opposite of what he promised when he got Congress to defund them. So his language is plain, it's ungrammatical, it's often incoherent, a word salad. He reiterates things. He does not make people feel dumb by being too clever in his speech. His inability to achieve things could be his undoing. But he tells regular Americans they've been duped by the rich. And he goes in for the no true Scotsman fallacy. I'm not an elitist. What? Because I wear a baseball cap? So he attacks the decadence of the wealthy, and he calls for civility despite being so uncivil. He says others are perverts when of course he is. Imagery, he speaks in pictures so people can understand that. But not all his claims are specious. ISIS exists, but he exaggerates the severity of the peril, and he presents the nation as being in jeopardy. He plays fast and loose with figures like McCarthy and the communists. How many are in the State Department? 57, 205, 300, 80, 81? It was 0 in the end. So Trump will do that with numbers. It's questionable if he even believes in these falsehoods, but he's always bombarding people with insults. He has these opprobrious names for his rivals. He belittles people. He resorts to crude physical insults and ad hominem. And he sympathises with his supporters' sense of humiliation the past few decades. They have a sense of entitlement to decently paid jobs. And his attacks resonate with a certain segment of the populace. And he's built up a rapport with the white working class. He's very fork-tongued. Yet he accuses the Clintons of being liars, which they are. But Clinton was truthful in saying that the factories are not coming back. Trump is completely graceless. He has no sophistication. His delivery is ranting. But again, some people find that attractive. He's like a bicycle. You've got to move forward or you're going to fall over. So it doesn't allow people to calm down or to analyse. So he thinks that real debate is a feat. He talked about pillaging Iraq for its oil. Smash and grab with him. It's that crude. So he's all about emotional impact, not about practicality. Pretending that there are magic bullets, miracle solutions to complex issues. He goes in for dualism. The world is good or evil. You've got to be with me or against me. There's no middle ground. And that's why he encourages intimidation and violence at his rallies. And it helps keep him the center of attention. His name must be everywhere. That people want to believe in him. Some people do. Some people wish to be dominated. He craves adulation and he's getting it. He's so exalted. He practices nepotism. He's building up the cult of the personality and making decisions instinctively. So his followers have suspended their critical faculty. They don't have much in the way of cognitive aptitude. So he's adept at garnering media attention. He misdirects from real problems such as healthcare, going into red herrings like the caravan as a decoy from actual problems.